Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we're starting on a new project inspired by Plants vs. Zombies. Now, if you've watched the No Object project Let's Dev, you already know how it affected my perspective of the Plants vs. Zombies demake. And after spending some time thinking it over, I came to the conclusion that the project was interesting in concept, but not so much in the execution. Which brings us to the next step in our long journey, not a remake, not a demake, but an entirely original idea inspired by Plants vs. Zombies. And what better way to mix things up than to, set it in space? That's right, we'll be creating a Plants vs. Zombies style game that takes place in space. The gameplay will feature a similar setup to Plants vs. Zombies, only the game board will be spread out across the circumference of a rotating planet. Now, this is pretty ambitious for me personally, mostly due to the math, so today we'll simply focus on trying to make the whole rotating plants thing a reality. So grab your calculators and let's get to coding this PvZ inspired madness. First thing was setting up a temporary planet, which will differ in size later. Next, we needed something to represent a placeable unit, so a temporary Astro Shooter sprite was created. Totally original design, not based off anything whatsoever. Anyway, with our total unique sprite finished, it was back to the code where a DS grid was created. This grid will work similarly to how it did in the remake/demake projects. A world angle variable was also added, which will control the current angle of the planet in relation to the level. And now came the hard part. First, I set up a distance check to measure the moss's position from the middle of the screen, aka the planet's position in the level. Now, before we continue, let's go over how I plan to do this. We're going to take each row of the DS grid and splay them out equally around the circumference of the planet. Using directional offsets, we'll take the moss's position in relation to the world angle, and then use that to determine which of the rows of data we should be manipulating. So no matter which quote-unquote direction the planet is facing, the relative position of each cell in our DS grid will remain the same. So next came the hard part of creating that angle offset. Because, again, surprise surprise, I'm not good at math. After spending a ton of time doing a ridiculous amount of minor tweaking, I was finally able to get several rows of DS grid data to display across the planet's surface, just as we needed. However, when turning the world, the code would break due to an error in the math. And so, in order to get a better grasp on the math, I made several shortcuts and functions to simplify some of the calculations. And again, after a ton of tweaking, I was finally able to get each row to rotate along with the world as it turns. So with that working, it was now time to tackle the even harder part, the offset of the offset. So again, the goal here was to negate the angle offsets so that the moss's relative position remains consistent regardless of the planet's angle. The concept itself wasn't alien to me, as I've done things similar when handling sprite stacking code. However, nothing I was doing here would produce the proper result. I thought the idea of subtracting the current world angle from the moss's position relative to the planet would be enough, and dividing that by the amount of rows in our grid should have given us the result we were after. But despite my tinkering, this wasn't happening. The offset was always off. So I took a break and reviewed the footage, only to then realize my mistake. According to the data drawn, there was a consistent difference of 180 degrees. Then it dawned on me. I was measuring the moss's relative position backwards. So switching the positions in the direction check solved an issue I couldn't figure out for over an hour. And though despite the great revelation, the measuring was still a bit unreliable. However, the content was consistent enough to attempt some manipulation, and some manipulate we would attempt. Back in the code, a left-click check was made. The event would toggle the data of whichever cell the moss is currently hovered over, with the distance being the x-coordinate and the angle being the y-coordinate. And again, despite some funky positioning, this was actually working. So with that working, I went back, cleaned up the code, and tried to automate as much as possible, so that resizes would be much easier down the line. This left us with some weird results, most likely due to my math. Pretty much anything hard-coded in with a number ended up breaking when I changed the size of the cells from 8 to 16. However, I was fine with a few broken pieces for now. I mostly wanted to see how this would do from a dynamic perspective. So after adding a key to rotate the world by 10 degrees, it was time to test. And tests showed it was not ready for dynamic usage. Changing the world angle to anything other than 0 would shift the rows, meaning our offset math wasn't working properly. which in turn meant that despite my best efforts, there was still a lot of trial and error to go. However, at this point, I'd been at this for 2 hours and I needed a break. I feel like I may poke around at this one off video, and once I've gotten the math figured out, then I'll record more. Because otherwise it'll just be episode after episode of no progress. And I may even work on other projects to help me understand this one better, like I did with the No Object project. So all I can say is stay tuned. But for now, that'll do it for this episode of Let's Dev. So leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.